Guadalcanal, August 1942, Day 9. A Marine corporal named James Russell has not slept in 72 hours. He knows this because he stopped counting at 72. His hands shake when he is not gripping his rifle. The man next to him fell asleep standing up during a patrol and walked into a tree. The man behind him has been hallucinating Japanese soldiers in the tree line since yesterday afternoon and has twice raised his weapon at shadows. None of them are going anywhere. There are real Japanese soldiers in the tree line too. And the Marines know this because 40 minutes ago one of them threw a grenade into the foxhole 3 positions to the left, and the man in that foxhole killed him with a bayonet before he could throw another one. This is Guadalcanal on Day 9. The Japanese regimental commander, observing from across the Matanikau River, has a problem his military education has not prepared him for. His intelligence reports tell him that the Marines on that ridgeline have been in continuous combat for 9 days, with minimal resupply and no rotation out of the line. His doctrine tells him that a force in that condition should be in collapse. His eyes tell him something different. This is no man's land. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New documentaries drop every single week. The Imperial Japanese military's understanding of human endurance limits was not uninformed. Japanese commanders had studied the physiology of combat exhaustion and had built it into their operational planning with a precision that reflected genuine professional thinking about how long a force could sustain high-intensity combat before its effectiveness degraded to the point of tactical irrelevance. The standard Japanese operational assumption for offensive operations was that an attacking force maintaining continuous contact with the enemy would begin to show measurable performance degradation after 48 hours without sleep and would become tactically unreliable after 72. Beyond 96 hours, Japanese doctrine treated a sleep-deprived unit as a force that could hold a position under direct threat, but could not be trusted to maneuver, coordinate, or respond effectively to unexpected tactical developments. These assumptions were derived from the Japanese military's own experience of extended combat in China and from the study of European military operations in the First World War, where exhaustion-driven command failures had produced some of the most catastrophic tactical decisions of the conflict. The Japanese military had incorporated that knowledge into a doctrine that treated sleep deprivation as a weapon to be exploited rather than a condition to be endured. The specific tactical application in the Pacific was the night harassment attack. Small Japanese forces would probe American lines through the night, making noise, throwing grenades, occasionally assaulting, and then withdrawing before a concentrated American response could be organized. The purpose was not to take ground. The purpose was to prevent sleep. A Marine who spent 3 consecutive nights responding to harassment attacks and then faced a major assault on the 4th day was, in Japanese operational theory, a Marine whose reaction time was degraded, whose judgment was compromised, and whose unit cohesion was fraying in ways that a fresh attacking force could systematically exploit. The doctrine was professionally sound. Its only flaw was that the force it was designed to exhaust into collapse had been specifically built not to collapse on the schedule the doctrine predicted. The science that Japanese military planners were applying when they designed sleep deprivation as a tactical tool was accurate as far as it went. Sleep deprivation at the levels experienced by Marines in extended Pacific Island combat produces measurable and progressive degradation across every cognitive and physical performance domain that military effectiveness depends on. After 24 hours without sleep, reaction time slows by approximately 25%. Fine motor coordination degrades. The ability to process complex information and generate appropriate responses slows significantly. After 48 hours, the degradation compounds. Microsleeps begin occurring involuntarily. Brief losses of consciousness lasting 2 to 30 seconds that the sleepless person typically cannot detect in themselves and that can occur at any moment regardless of environmental stimulation, including during activities that require full alertness. After 72 hours, hallucinations begin in a meaningful percentage of subjects. The visual cortex begins generating imagery that the conscious mind interprets as real perceptual experience. Men see things that are not there. They hear sounds without external source. Their emotional regulation becomes severely compromised, producing responses to routine stimuli that range from inappropriate aggression to sudden emotional collapse. Beyond 96 hours, cognitive function degrades to the point where even simple sequential tasks become unreliable, where a man may begin an action and forget its purpose before completing it, where the integration of sensory information into a coherent operational picture becomes genuinely difficult rather than merely impaired. The physiological picture that emerges from this research is of a human nervous system progressively losing its ability to interface accurately with reality. What Japanese operational planners had correct was every element of that picture. What they had wrong was the assumption that the picture described what would happen to Marine units in extended Pacific combat as opposed to what would happen to average human beings in laboratory sleep deprivation studies conducted on subjects who had never been trained to expect and manage the experience. The Marine Corps had been thinking about exhaustion and performance under sustained deprivation long before the Pacific War created the conditions that would test its conclusions. The small wars of the early 20th century, the interventions in Nicaragua and Haiti and Santo Domingo that had shaped Marine institutional culture across the 1920s and 30s, had produced operational experience that the Corps had incorporated into its training philosophy at every level. The central lesson, stated explicitly in Marine training doctrine and reinforced through field exercises designed to produce genuine rather than simulated exhaustion, was that the gap between what a man believed his limit was and what his actual limit was tended to be very large and very consistently underestimated. Marines in training were regularly pushed past the point where they believed they could continue, and they regularly discovered that they could continue. This was not accidental sadism or institutional machismo. It was a deliberate training methodology built on a specific institutional insight about the relationship between perceived limits and actual limits. A Marine who had already discovered in training that he could function after 48 hours without sleep under physical stress, while being required to make tactical decisions and care for his equipment and his fellow Marines, was a Marine who would not be surprised by the experience when it arrived in combat. He would not waste cognitive resources on the existential question of whether he could continue, because he already knew the answer from direct personal experience in a controlled environment where that question had been deliberately posed and answered. That prior knowledge, that established certainty about the distance between the alarm and the actual limit, was itself a performance multiplier in the field. The Japanese doctrine predicted collapse at a point that Marine training had already taught its men to recognize as the alarm rather than the end. And the difference between treating that signal as an alarm and treating it as a terminal condition was the difference between the unit that kept going and the unit that did not. The campaign on Guadalcanal from August of 1942 through February of 1943 was the first sustained test of what Marine units could endure in terms of sleep deprivation combined with combat, tropical disease, nutritional deficit, and the specific psychological pressure of fighting a night-active enemy in jungle terrain where darkness was not a period of reduced threat, but a period of heightened threat, requiring active defensive vigilance. The Marines who landed on August 7th found themselves in a fight that their supply situation, disrupted almost immediately by Japanese naval action, could not adequately support. Rations were short. Medical supplies were limited. Rotation out of the line was not available because there were not enough Marines on the island to create a reserve. The men who went in first stayed in. For the Marines on the Tanaru River line and on Bloody Ridge and along the Matanikau, the operational reality of Guadalcanal was chronic sleep deprivation for weeks rather than days. The Japanese harassment doctrine was applied with consistency throughout the campaign. Night after night, Japanese infantry units probed the Marine perimeter, threw grenades, fired at muzzle flashes, and withdrew before first light. The Marines responded to every probe because not responding meant a probe became a breach. So they responded every night and then fought during the day. The cumulative effect on individual Marines was exactly what Japanese doctrine predicted in terms of physiological state. Men were exhausted beyond anything they had experienced in training. What Japanese doctrine did not predict was what exhausted Marines did next. The answer, documented in Marine after-action reports and in the accounts of Japanese officers who survived the campaign, was that they kept attacking, not because they were not exhausted, not because the exhaustion was not real, but because the Marine Corps had built into them a response to exhaustion that was different from the response Japanese doctrine had modeled, and that difference was not something that could be read from any external observation of their physiological state. The question of what actually kept sleep-deprived Marines functioning at levels that violated Japanese operational predictions has multiple answers that operate at different levels of analysis, and the most accurate account acknowledges all of them rather than reducing the explanation to a single factor. At the individual level, the answer is the one the Marine Corps had built into its training. Men who had been pushed past their perceived limits in controlled environments had internalized a specific response pattern to the experience of exhaustion. When the cognitive alarm that normally signals a human organism to stop and rest fired, Marines had been conditioned to distinguish between the alarm and the actual limit. The alarm fires at the same point regardless of how much remains in reserve. Marine training taught men to hear the alarm and keep moving anyway, because they had direct experiential knowledge that there was more in reserve after the alarm than before it. At the unit level, the answer is the Marine Corps emphasis on mutual accountability and unit identity. A Marine who was physically capable of keeping his eyes open and holding his position did not allow himself to stop because the men around him were also physically capable of keeping their eyes open and holding their positions. The social architecture of the Marine squad, the specific bond between men who had trained together and who understood that their survival was directly tied to the performance of the man next to them, created a form of sustained motivation that operated independently of individual physiological state. The man who could not make himself continue for his own sake could make himself continue for the man on his left. This was not an accident of Marine culture. It was the explicit intended outcome of a training system that had deliberately built interdependence into the squad structure as a performance sustainer in exactly the conditions that Guadalcanal and every subsequent island campaign would produce. The Japanese military's formal documentation of its encounters with sleep-deprived Marine units across the Pacific campaign contains passages that reveal the progressive revision of Japanese operational assumptions about American endurance limits in real time. The earliest assessments from the Guadalcanal period reflect the original doctrine. Intelligence reports from late August and September of 1942 describe the Marine defensive positions as being held by forces that Japanese analysts assessed as approaching the limits of effective resistance. The language is clinical and professional, the assessment of men applying a doctrine they believe in to evidence they are observing accurately. The later assessments tell a different story. After the failure of the major Japanese offensive operations against Henderson Field in September and October of 1942, operations timed specifically to exploit the expected collapse of sleep-deprived Marine defenders, Japanese after-action reports begin to contain passages notable for their departure from doctrinal confidence. One report from October of 42, written by a staff officer attached to the 17th Army headquarters, states explicitly that the American forces' ability to sustain defensive effectiveness after extended periods without rest has not conformed to operational projections, and that the basis of those projections requires re-examination. That sentence, written after watching a major offensive operation fail against defenders his doctrine said should have been incapable of effective resistance, is the formal institutional acknowledgement that the model was wrong. The re-examination he called for was never systematically completed because the pace of the campaign did not permit it, but the acknowledgement that it was needed is documented and specific and represents one of the clearest moments in the entire Pacific War, where a Japanese military professional put on paper exactly what he had observed and exactly what it meant for everything his institution had built its operational planning around. If Guadalcanal was the first sustained test of what Marines could endure without sleep, Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945 was the extreme case that defined the outer boundary of the answer. The 36 days of the Iwo Jima campaign produced sleep deprivation of a severity that had no precedent in the Pacific War, and that challenged the physiological model Japanese operational planning had been built around from a completely different direction than Guadalcanal had. The Japanese defensive system on Iwo Jima, with its 17 miles of tunnels and its 500 interconnected fighting positions, was specifically engineered to prevent any period of American operational pause that might allow sleep. The tunnel network meant that cleared positions could be reoccupied by Japanese defenders who had moved through underground passages, while the Marines above them believed the area was secure. Marines who had spent a day assaulting a ridge complex would spend the subsequent night defending against defenders who had reappeared in positions that should have been empty, which meant the night that should have offered some recovery from the day's exertion was spent instead in alert defensive posture against threats materializing from directions already cleared. Marines on Iwo Jima were operating in a tactical environment specifically engineered to make any sustained sleep physiologically impossible, not merely difficult. Japanese commanders who designed this system had done so with the expectation that it would produce the collapse their doctrine predicted. On the 29th day of the battle, Marine units that had averaged fewer than 3 hours of continuous sleep in 4 weeks were still assaulting fortified positions in the northern end of the island. The collapse the defensive design was supposed to produce had not arrived and was not going to arrive before the island was taken. One of the least examined but most practically significant factors in Marine unit performance under sustained sleep deprivation was the role of small unit rituals and routine in maintaining functional cohesion when individual cognitive capacity was genuinely degraded to the point where complex reasoning was unreliable. The Marine Corps, through its training system and its unit culture, had embedded a set of procedural routines into rifle squad and fire team behavior that were designed to be executable in a degraded cognitive state because they had been rehearsed to the point of genuine automaticity. The standing watch rotation was the most fundamental of these. In any Marine defensive position, regardless of the tactical situation, regardless of how exhausted the unit was, the watch rotation continued on its schedule. The man whose watch ended woke his replacement, briefed him on anything observed, and went to sleep for whatever period the rotation allowed. This sounds trivially simple, but its practical significance in conditions of extreme exhaustion was substantial. The rotation meant that no Marine was ever entirely without a moment of sleep for as long as the system functioned, however brief those moments were. It distributed the responsibility for maintaining awareness across the unit, rather than resting it on any individual. It meant a man whose hallucinations had become severe enough to impair his judgment would be replaced on watch in a predictable time frame by a man whose hallucinations were less severe because he had slept more recently. The system was not a solution to sleep deprivation. It was a management protocol that distributed the degradation across the unit in a way that prevented any single point of failure from collapsing the whole. And it functioned because it had been rehearsed until it required almost no conscious direction to execute. Because the Marines who ran it were operating in exactly the cognitive conditions under which automatic behavioral routines outperform conscious deliberation as a guide to action. The Japanese military's failure to correctly predict and account for Marine performance under sustained sleep deprivation was not corrected during the Pacific War, because correcting it would have required a fundamental revision of the operational assumptions that Japanese campaign planning was built around. And that revision was not achievable within the institutional and temporal constraints of an active war against an adversary that was not giving the Japanese command structure the time or the operational space to conduct the kind of systematic re-evaluation that the evidence demanded. Japanese commanders who observed Marine units continuing to function after 3 days without sleep were not observing something their doctrine had no framework for at all. The framework existed. The problem was that the framework's predictions were wrong, and acknowledging that the framework's predictions were wrong required acknowledging that a significant portion of the operational planning built on those predictions was also wrong. That acknowledgement carried institutional costs that the Japanese command structure was not equipped to absorb in the middle of a campaign already going badly in every material dimension. The specific lesson that Marine performance under sleep deprivation should have taught Japanese operational planners that human endurance limits are not fixed physiological constants but are substantially shaped by institutional preparation, training philosophy, and unit culture, was a lesson that would have required the Japanese military to reconsider not just one operational assumption, but the entire framework of assumptions about what soldiers could be made to do and endure that Japanese military culture had been building since the Meiji Restoration. The Japanese commanders who wrote in their after-action reports that the Americans did not behave according to prediction were not wrong about what they observed. They were wrong about what it meant and about what it would have required to change it. What it would have required was building a different kind of soldier from a different kind of institution. And that was not a change that could be made in the years remaining in the war, even by commanders who understood exactly what they needed. A Japanese regimental commander on Guadalcanal looked at men who had not slept in 3 days and calculated that they were approaching the end of what they could do. He was using the right numbers. He was applying the right physiology. The conclusion was still wrong. The Marines behind that perimeter were not approaching the end of what they could do. They were discovering, as Marines had been discovering in training for 2 decades, that the end was further away than anyone who had not already been there could calculate from the outside. That gap between the predicted limit and the actual limit was not an accident of character or a product of individual willpower. It was built. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button right now. It is the single best way to push this story to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific or the Marine Corps. We will see you in the next one.